Welcome. You know, we seldom start lectures on time, but I think the alumni clearly show up on time compared to the students. So thank you and welcome. I'm Mi Jin Yoon, the Dean of the College of Architecture, Art and Planning. I want to thank you all, our alumni and friends and faculty and staff who are joining us here today, both in person and virtually for the Rubacha Featured Speaker Lecture Series in celebration of Reunion 2022. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement, which will be read by Josh Washington, a second-year master's in regional planning student.
Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and lines of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters.
Thank you, Josh. I'd also like to thank Paul Rubacha, who's joining us today in his reunion year, class of 1972, for his support that makes our lecture series possible, and for his incredibly generous recent gift to establish a multi-college department of real estate at Cornell. The new Paul Rubacha Department of Real Estate was announced just a few days ago, and I'm very excited for our college's partnership with the S.C. Johnson College of Business and Dean Andrew Caroli. The new department builds on a 30-year legacy of real estate education at Cornell and will bring together real estate finance and development with critical expertise in the built environment that shapes our cities and communities. Thank you, Paul, for all you've done for Cornell. We can clap again. Our speaker series today is particularly special because we're celebrating a very important milestone at AAP, the architecture's sesquicentennial and a century of art education. Over the last 9 months in the college, we've had opportunities not only to celebrate, but to reflect, to look back both on our recent and distant past, and through that looking glass, also peer forward towards the future. In continuation and in celebration of the 2022 Cornell Reunion, we're joined today by 2 esteemed alumni, the artist Shelly Silver and the architect Peter Eisenman, whose creative and discursive works have influenced generations of not only students, but also teachers. One of the perks of being the dean of the college is that I get to still give assignments and even to alumni. And the assignment we gave to both Peter and Shelly was to reflect on their time at Cornell and AAP, drawing connections from then to now and sharing insights from the decades across which they have built their careers and have had a profound impact on the disciplines of art and architecture and the world. Shelly Silver is a New York City-based photographer, filmmaker, and educator. She received her Bachelor's of Fine Arts from the Department of Art in 1980, at a time when photography itself was being debated as an art form. It's my understanding that it was during her time at Cornell that she was encouraged to pursue film, but there was only one film course available at Cornell. Since then, she's gone on to create over 10 feature-length films, numerous shorts with screenings and installations nationally and internationally at venues such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Yokohama Museum of Art, Tate Modern, the Centre Pompidou, among others. Shelly has also received fellowships and grants from organizations such as the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA, the New York State Council of the Arts, the Jerome Foundation, the Japan Foundation, and Anonymous Was a Woman, among many other awards and honors. Shelly's films have been recognized as both grounded in what is and for begging the question, what isn't? The hallmark of her work is its unique ability to play with fact and fiction, to simultaneously shed light and cast doubt on everyday expectations and claims to truth. In speaking about what drew her to film, Shelly has shared that it was not only the medium's endless potential as a form of visual language and a means of connecting people to the world, but also her ability to make work that challenged our assumptions about narrative, politics, identity, and history, something she continues to do as an artist and educator, and I'm sure she will engage us in that today. We're also incredibly fortunate to have architecture alumnus and internationally recognized architect and educator Peter Eisenman, founder and principal of Eisemann Architects, here with us today. Peter will share his story about his time at Cornell and his prolific decades-long career afterwards. Peter received his Bachelor of Architecture in 1954 at a time when the US and much of the world was still coming to grips with the sweeping changes that followed the Second World War. Looking back, it would be a mistake to say Peter is a product of his time or of the disciplinary debates at the time. There's no doubt that he gained invaluable knowledge as a student at Cornell in the 50s. And fortunately for the discipline of architecture, I learned just recently, Peter transferred from being a chemistry major into architecture at the end of his freshman year. While he reflects fondly of his days at Cornell, he refers to his undergraduate architecture years as more a choice between Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier than the hotbed of intellectual debate. And he recalls that it was not until the 1960s, while studying with Colin Rowe at Cambridge, that he realized the importance of critical thought to the basis of architecture. That, quote, "To be critical meant learning to see not only what was present, but also what was absent." This has clearly stayed with him, but given who Peter is, it would be better to ask what he demanded of his time and what he contributed to his time. From his earliest moments in architecture as a student, through his career as an educator, and founding the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And as a prolific architect, Peter has consistently been an original, deeply critical thinker who demands the same of people who encounter his ideas and work. As he acknowledges precedents, he breaks them down and builds new ones. As he encounters concepts in critical theory and philosophy, he activates them as possible modes of evolving architectural form and thought. For his scholarship and work that extends from cultural to institutional works, for contribution after contribution to the discipline, he has consistently pushed forward for decades and has been recognized with numerous awards and honors, including the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects, the Smithsonian Institution's 2001 Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture, the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the 2004 Venice Biennale. And in May 2010, Peter was honored with the Wolf Foundation Prize in the Arts. And in 2020, he received the prestigious Gold Medal for Architecture in the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Currently, he's a visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture and continues to be deeply invested in architecture pedagogy and the future of the discipline. Thank you, Shelly and Peter, for joining us today as we come together to reconnect across generations this reunion weekend. And as we take this opportunity to mark the 150th anniversary of architecture and the 100th anniversary of art at Cornell. As critical thinkers, creative practitioners, and dedicated educators, I know I speak for all of us when I say that we're looking forward to hearing your reflections on your time at Cornell and what came after, as well as where we stand today and where we go from here. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Shelly and Peter back to AAP. And I will first ask Shelly to take the podium.
From morning, round till night, round and round the earth, turning, turning, always round till morning.
Frog Spider Handhorse House is set between forest and suburb. I turn my camera towards children as they learn the languages necessary to enter our world, and towards animals as they are forced to engage with our built environment. I wanted to bring a watchful attention, a care manifested through looking to these mysterious and increasingly beleaguered groups of beings. The film is structured like a game played by children who keep changing the rules. My work is about storytelling as a process of collective fantasizing. I don't love public speaking, just like I prefer to be behind, not in front of the camera. The last few weeks writing this talk, I found myself shifting tone, register, and, as it were, age. At times, I've been my 20-year-old self, once again relentlessly questioning the person in front of the room. At other times, I've understood that now I am that person in front of the room. And then there's the question of tone. This is not a commencement speech, so I could ditch the optimism, mixed with a slight troubling of the water, the challenges ahead to be overcome, etc. I'm speaking to patriots and strangers. There's something sibling-like talking to fellow alumni. I imagine you thinking, that's not how I remember it. My homework assignment was to speak about my artistic practice and the future of pedagogy, two topics not necessarily attached at the hip. I'm also haunted by a third bigger subject, the elephant in the room that keeps gnawing at my brain and gut, threatening to overtake the others. More on this later. A story. My name is Shelly Silver. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. When I was 10, we moved to Long Island as part of what is sometimes referred to as the Jewish Exodus. I went to Cornell because my brother went here, and my parents liked the idea of keeping us together. Cornell gave us a deal. My parents never would have agreed to me going to art school otherwise. They wanted me to be a scientist, even though, or perhaps because they were scientists who wanted to be artists.
そう、小さい時に本当にいつも見てた夢っていうのがあって、私の家族がこう並んで立ってて、それで真正面から飛行機が飛んでくる。それで飛行機からミサイルがもうすごい撃ってくるのね。それで私だけ弾には当たらないで、家族がみんな殺されちゃう夢っていうのがなんかいつも見てて、家族と離れたくないっていう気持ちと、家族から早く抜けたいっていう気持ちがすごいこう ちっちゃい時からあったので、それがきっと出たのかなって。
Despite my parents' faulty logic, Cornell was fantastic for me, arguing world-changing topics deep into the night, fueled by bad truck pizza. I was a pesky student, questioning concepts, authority, you name it. And now I have students who do this to me, and I'm grateful for it, ecstatic about it, even as I may curse my bad karma. My fellow art students at Cornell were predominantly women. We were taught by full-time faculty, all but one of whom were men. When I told the chair that this should change, he told me that they had tried, but they couldn't find any women good enough. Perhaps it was a lack of imagination. He just couldn't imagine it.
Wenn ich ehrlich bin, vielleicht war Jesus Christus ja auch eine Frau und niemand weiß es. Und er hat ja das Christentum eher verkündet. Vielleicht dachten die Menschen, das können nur Männer. Ich würde denken, höchstpersönlich, dass ich es sehr schön finde, weil Jesus eine Frau war. Und ich finde es sogar besser, wenn Jesus vielleicht auch gar kein Geschlecht hat, dass es beides sein könnte.
Some important moments. I participated on all of these, save the takeover of Willard's Great Hall, but I felt its reverberations strongly when I arrived here in 1975. It gave Cornell a legacy to build on. I always felt that the takeover put what was seen as a sleepy upstate college with a large ag school on the map, attracting politically engaged professors who thought that a movement might be starting here. Each of these events, as well as the trajectory connected one to the next, form part of my outlook on the world. They've made me a more hopeful person. What does it take to make people leave the comfort of their dorm rooms, houses, or apartments to come together, putting themselves at risk? My practice involves extended looking and questioning, whether directly or indirectly, myself and others. I use my camera as a bridge, a way in, a reason to stay, to meet, to formulate over time. I never smoked, but when I was younger, I always liked to bum cigarettes for my friends. This small pretext to meet strangers was embedded in the social fabric of the time. A camera can have a similar effect, creating connections with none of the bad side effects. It's also like fishing. One can spend hours waiting for a flicker of interest. My films often take place in public space, these places that belong to everyone and no one. In 2008, during the primary that would lead to Obama's first presidency, I took to the streets to ask New Yorkers a series of questions about their lives, city, and country. Are you satisfied? Do you feel you have a voice in your country? Does equal opportunity exist in the United States? What are you most scared of?
Are we responsible for the government we have?
When you say we're talking about the American people?
We as citizens, like am I personally responsible for the way that the country is now?
I do think we're responsible for the government that we have.
Yes, we are responsible for the government we have.
The responsibility for our government is on our shoulders. We can't dismiss it. We have a voice. I mean, we're free. What does freedom mean? Like we fought Martin Luther King, like we're in Harlem, Adam playing power. You know, we're responsible.
Government is people. We are the people. We are the government. We are responsible for the government we have because we voted for them.
We are the ones who voted the crooks in.
We voted them in.
We voted for them.
We voted for them.
If you are not, then who is?
If you're not, then who is? And what I'm looking for, I set up a very simple structure akin to an experiment. I set out to photograph moments of intimacy in public spaces in Lower Manhattan soon after September 11th. I found participants through an internet dating site, asking them how they wanted to be photographed. Some people's desires were, not surprisingly, sexual, but others took the invitation to expand in broader and more unexpected directions.
He writes from Japan that he wants to be photographed at Ground Zero. I think tourist. We meet and he talks of 3 places, 3 separate events. The destruction of the World Trade Center, the earthquake in Kobe, and the bombing of Hiroshima. 2001, 1995, 1945. He tells me of a Japanese news show broadcast after September 11th, which reported that only 20% of Americans knew what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His father, a small child during the bombing of Hiroshima, survived by wildly running away through fields and across streams. Most of the people from his village were killed, annihilated. These 3 events, these 3 places, brought together in the stories. Can a photo capture this?
What I'm looking for is based on my actual experiences wrapped in a story told by a fictional narrator. I often work in fiction as I find it liberating to imagine situations, stories, and people that don't exist or don't exist yet, but should. I wrote, shot, and edited Touch simultaneously, filming from the point of view of the narrator protagonist, who is a retired librarian, thus his interest in archival photographs and history, real and imagined. It was filmed in New York City's Chinatown, where I've lived since 1986, and where the unnamed, unseen narrator returns home to take care of his dying mother. He uses a camera to find a way back into this neighborhood that he couldn't leave fast enough. This neighborhood, which is now gentrifying, which is to say, disappearing.
这些照片是在1902年一个阳光明媚的下午拍摄的。那时在美国排华法案已经生效有20年，并且很快就改为无限期的有效。而当时的中国义和团运动暴力反抗西方帝国主义，鸦片贸易、列强瓜分土地、传教士们，接下来却是武力镇压。那时几乎1/4的世界人口都在英国统治下。就在那年，而沃尔特·迪斯尼将要出生。维多利亚女王将要死了。在纽约市一个光秃秃的屋顶上，后来它被涂抹掉了。当时非常炎热。这些孩子们看起来既不年轻，也不畅快，一点都不幸福。过了40年，他们在哪儿呢？他长大后会成为社会学家，而他将长成为一名喜剧演员，与范尼·布莱斯一起演戏。可想象的，于是可能的。话语使不可能的成为可想象的，因而变为可能的。不可能性是局外人的领域。
My fictional trilogy, Frog, Spider, Hand, Horse, House, A Strange New Beauty, and A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch all somehow deal with the hint, possibility, or likelihood of the upcoming end of civilization. A Tiny Place That Is Hard to Touch was filmed in Tatekawa, a small neighborhood in Tokyo that was firebombed and completely destroyed on March 9th, 1945, when the US, in the single most destructive bombing raid in human history, destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed 100,000 citizens. It is a love story between an American researcher and her Japanese translator, their interactions repeatedly hijacked into science fiction territory, as the translator interrupts their work sessions with stories from a world infected with the knowledge of its own demise. Why? Because we can. On that cheerful note, I will hand in the other half of my homework assignment. Here are two lists detailing possibilities for the future of pedagogy, the so-called heaven and hell list. First, hell. A note on number one. When I attended Cornell, there were a series of demonstrations against rising tuition, which maxed out at around $3,300 per year. Today, at both Cornell and Columbia, where I currently teach, tuition has crossed the $60,000 line. Some struggles were not fought hard enough. And the future of pedagogy heaven version. A note on number 8, faculty diversity. This has changed, albeit recently, so much since my time at Cornell. For example, when I started at Columbia in 2009, I was the only full-time woman faculty member in the art department. 13 years later, there's been a sea change. I can't emphasize enough how much difference this makes for students and faculty. And now I will speak frankly about the reason that it's been so hard for me to get my head around this talk. I'm infuriated, I'm scared, I'm deer in the headlights. The disappearance of women's rights and voters' rights. The US downgraded for the first time in its history from democracy to anocracy. And anocracy is a state that is part democracy, part dictatorship. Added to this, the extreme economic inequality, the richest 10% of the world owning 76% of the wealth. And in this country, it's even more extreme, places the US at high risk of impending political instability and civil war. And then the mass shooting in Buffalo, the mass shooting in Uvalde, and the heartbreakingly many mass shootings that have happened after that. For me, the most terrifying and the overarching defining theme of our times is impending climate catastrophe, later for some, here already for others. Overpopulation, scarcity of resources, and temperatures that are wreaking havoc across the globe, while our culture is driven by the necessary growth that capitalism demands. Build bigger, drive bigger, live bigger. There's a quote that's popped up often in recent months. It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. Judging from the stories we tell in films, books, media, this is true. I make engaged work, but I'm not an activist. I have limited expertise here, but the people at Cornell AAP were nice or stupid enough to give me this place in front of the room to speak, so I am. I don't have specific proposals. I do know that unless we want things to go very badly in this country, we must become more engaged and quickly, whichever way possible. I also know, I think we all do, that we have to change the way we live and consume as quickly as possible if we want any future for upcoming generations. It's better to do this now when we have some control and choice over the way the world is going to change. We are smart, resourceful people, designers and architects and artists and planners. We can imagine things that others perhaps cannot. I leave you with fragments from a poem by Lucille Clifton. Today we are possible. What we will become waits in us like an ache. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelly, for sharing your work and thoughts. Very critical and important, timely questions that I hope we have time to dig deeper into in the Q&A. You know, you mentioned commencement speeches, and this is not the audience for a commencement speech, but I did want to share maybe just one quote that was shared with our recent graduates this commencement from Bell Hooks in Teaching to Transgress. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In the field of opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and of our comrades an openness of mind that allows us to face reality even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom. And I think you do that in your work, Shelly. And I would like to imagine that we can all transgress and actualize possibilities. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Peter Eisenman to the front, where he will also share his thoughts and reflections.
Colin Rowe once said to me that when you hit 75, you can sit to give a lecture. I'm going to take his advice. I originally had prepared a 3-hour talk because I'm celebrating 150 years of Big Deal, so I thought an hour for each 50. I was then advised that that would not be appropriate. So I'm going to give you, in 20 minutes that I've been allowed, the first chapter of my life at Cornell. You got to imagine in 1950, middle-class suburbanite in South Orange, New Jersey, never thinking a thought, never thinking anything except being in a kind of middle-class cotton wool. I obviously never thought anything, and I'd never heard the word architect. Where I wanted to go was Harvard, because my first cousin was attending Harvard, and I had been up to see him. So I arranged at the time, and it was possible to do an interview with the director of admissions at Harvard. It was quite clear to me and to Harvard at the end of that interview that I did not have the cultural sophistication required to enter Cambridge. And fortunately, my brother, who had a stuttering defect, was being seen by a very expert psychiatrist in New York City, a man by the name of Smiley Blanton. And Mr. Blanton said, let me see his brother, and talk to his brother. And Mr. Blanton, after sizing me up, went to my father and said, look, he's not going to go to Harvard, but I tell you, the right place for him is Cornell. Send him to Cornell. And my father said, why does he need to go there? He can go to Rutgers, where I went, with State University, tuition, it's all those things. And he said, he's much too sensitive to go to Rutgers. Cornell is perfect. So I was enrolled at Cornell in organic chemistry. And I spent my first year at Founders Hall down at the bottom of the hill at 8 o'clock in the morning, taking a 2-hour German class every morning so that I could pass a proficiency necessary for organic chemistry. I hated it, and especially climbing up the live slope in the winter at 8 o'clock was no picnic, and going to the class in Morrill Hall, and it was now looking back on it, could have been taught by a few ex-Wehrmacht people. We were so close at the time in 1950 to the end of the war. Who knows what these people were? And as a matter of fact, I remember saying, meine Lieblingsfilmschauspielerin is Paula Vesely. Paula Vesely turned out to be a Nazi favorite, but this is what I was being taught. In any case, it was close to a disaster. At the same time, I was swimming on the freshman swimming team and doing quite well. We were undefeated that year. I'd been a high school swimmer. And so the swimming kept me, it was the only ego advantage that I had, only ego confirmation that I had was that I could swim. And if you went to the Old Armory pool, it was really another case. In any case, I went on probation in my spring term. That means I couldn't swim. I couldn't do any extracurricular activities, and I was in danger of flunking out of Cornell. At the same time, I discovered in the basement of Founders Hall a dorm counselor named Bill Troutman, who was a fifth-year architecture student. And I saw I didn't know what architecture was, but I saw he was making models and drawing. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm studying architecture, and this is what I said, I used to do this in high school. I didn't know you could make models and draw your way through college. He said, oh, it's great. And I thought, oh my God, had missed something up to this moment. I went home on Easter vacation. I waited till the last minute. This whole story is a very fragile story, how I almost didn't make it to architecture. In any case, an hour before I was to leave for my ride back to Ithaca in spring vacation, I announced to my mother and father, I have something to tell you. The horror that went through the shock that I had something to say, something important enough, by the way, to do it in the living room of our house, which was never used except for funerals and weddings and things like that. I demanded to be heard in the living room, where I think the slip covers were on, it was unseasonable, etc. They said, okay. And I said, I have something to tell you. I'm going to be an architect. Again, horror and dismay on the faces of my mother and father, and my father as well, who was usually a supporter of mine. And the first thing he said, of course, indelible in my mind, he said, "Is this another one of your jokes?" That you can understand the suburban living, what it was like in South Orange, New Jersey. In any case, I said, "No, it's not a joke." He said, "Okay, I'll pay for one more year of college. You've got to do well. If you don't do well, you're out. No Rutgers, no junior college, no nothing. You're out on the street, no education." With that, I went to the dean, Dean Mackesy at the time, and he said, "Okay, you've got to pass everything." There was no way that I was going to pass 6 hours of German in this situation. And later, was no way I was going to pass calculus as a freshman and sophomore in the architecture school. And so I did something which I hadn't done it before. I took a little detour from reality and the truth. And I asked a friend of mine, I said, who sat in front of me, I said, "If I can just copy half of your exam, I'll take half of it myself." He said, "Okay." I said, "It's really important for me to do." I've never told this story in public before. In any case, I got 50 on his part and 10 on my part, and I got into architecture. The reason I'm telling this story is because the one thing that Cornell is different from any other institution, first of all, it's an Ivy League institution with an undergraduate architecture program. If it hadn't had an undergraduate architecture program, I would have been out of the university and some other, God knows what I would have done. Maybe I would have worked it out. In any case, I was able to transfer to a young undergraduate architecture program. Cornell at the time didn't have a summer schools because I had to make up a year of messing about in organic chemistry, plus the fact that I had signed on to ROTC. The only way I avoided the Korean War at the time, and all of my classmates the same, were to sign on to ROTC, which meant in a week after my graduation commissioning, I would be on my way to a war zone. And it's something that I had no choice about. And so here I was, minus summers, and fortunately I was able to go to the University of Oregon for one summer, and then nicely the School of Architecture then said, "We'll give you a summer's credit." And so it was, I was able to join the sophomore class as a freshman and work my way through so that by the end of the 5th year, I was ready to go to Korea and with an architecture degree. The importance of the story is, for me, that there was no other school except, I think, MIT still had an undergraduate program at the time. I knew I wasn't going to get into MIT, that I could study architecture as an undergraduate in a humanist environment. And it was really important to me because I took Nabokov's class and various other people who were here at Cornell, and that architecture was situated within the humanities was very important. And of course, if I had gone to Cooper Union or SciArc or RISD or any of those schools, I would have just had a professional architectural degree. Fortunately, because of what my later work was about, I was able to find at Cornell's courses in literature, and I think I took one philosophy course. I forget who it was with, but in any case, these were things that were important at the time. And the fact that I could move from organic chemistry to architecture situated in an undergraduate program, I think was very important. Now, if we look back from today's point of view, there's a problem for undergraduate architects, and it's a very really real problem, and that is, in order to, let's say, after graduation, after getting a professional 5-year degree, to be able to teach, let's say, at a university, to escape the boredom, let's say, of office work, which is something that you all would find necessary, let's say, that teaching was a way that I found to continue to think about architecture and to grow. The problem for an undergraduate situation is that no one is going to hire anybody that doesn't have a master's degree or even a PhD, as it turns out. I was fortunate to be able to go to Columbia after working for 3 years and getting my license. I was fortunate then to go to Cambridge and get a PhD. I was fortunate to be able to come back from Cambridge and immediately go into Princeton to teach, eventually to other institutions, and to be at Yale for 18 years that I've been there now. The question is, what does one do if one wants to get an undergraduate degree, which we need to preserve? And so somehow there has to be a way of monitoring people who want something more with their undergraduate degree, need something more, and hopefully Cornell offers those kinds of things, continues to offer those kinds of things now and in the future. When I was about to go into professional practice, I was working at the Architects Collaborative in Boston, and I needed a way to increase the kinds of energies that I was had. That is, I needed a master's degree. I went to an old employer, Percival Goodman in New York and Columbia, and he said, come to Columbia and get a master's degree. I was okay. At the very moment, and this was a moment of real inspiration for me, I was having a dinner with a man named Jim Sterling. I didn't know who Jim Sterling was. It was his first year as Davenport professor. This was 1959 at Yale. It's the first year he'd been in the United States. And one of my colleagues, John Fowler, who had studied with Jim at the Regent Street Poly in London, invited Jim to come down and look at the projects we were doing and then have dinner with us. And we were sat on the floor. We had a Japanese meal, couldn't afford furniture or anything else. And we showed Jim the housing project that we were working on. And then about 5 minutes into this, he interrupted and said, hey, let me tell you something. And he looked at me and he said, and this was, again, a changing moment like the one with telling my mother I had something to tell her. Jim Sterling looked at me and said, Peter, you are a really good designer, but you don't know anything about architecture. And I thought, how could I be a good designer and not know anything about architecture? And he said, what you need to do is go and study with Colin Rowe. I didn't know who Colin Rowe was. I didn't realize he wasn't at Cornell at the time. He was at Cambridge. And so I went to Cambridge and I was with Colin for 2 years there before he came back to Cornell. But that was a turning point in my existence. A second turning point was the fact that I finally found out that there was something other than design, that is the design of buildings and doing design of buildings, that involved architecture, that architecture was a socio-political, economic design discipline that took into account a wide range of being. And from that day forward, first from the saying that I wanted to be an architect as an undergraduate, and secondly, being told by Jim Sterling to go to be with Colin Rowe, I was ready to become an architect. And so I'm here to say that I believe that Cornell was a formative and experience for me. Even though I do remember, and I need to tell this, that the way I found out that I was in architecture in the second year, it was on the swimming team. We were going for a big meet in Yale, and Yale was the champion team, and I was looking forward to swimming the 300 medley relay for Cornell. And I went to the old armory and I looked on the board, my name wasn't there. I thought, what? So I went to see Scotty Little, the coach at the time, and I said, Coach, what's up? I'm not going to Yale. He said, Peter, you used to be here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for your laps for 2 hours. I used to time you at 4 o'clock, and I used to go home for dinner. Now that you're in architecture, you come in at 5 o'clock after an architecture lab, and I have to wait till 7 for you only. You're the only person that has a lab in the afternoon. I have to wait to time you, and I'm not going to do this anymore. You're going to have to make a decision, and this was the third moment in my life of importance. He said, you're either going to be a swimmer or you're going to be an architect, because you're not going to continue on both. And I said, thanks, Coach. I understand what it is. I walked out, and that was the third thing. I became an architect. Thank you very much. I don't know if that was an advertisement for the school or not. I can't tell.
We don't do ads.
For swimming, it's not, no, it wasn't for swimming.
Well, thank you both, Peter, Shelly. And since we have such a great audience here, I don't want to monopolize your time, and we have such little time left. So we'd really like to open it up for questions for both Peter and Shelly.
Can I do one plug first?
Yes.
So listening to you, I have also a weird trajectory at Cornell that I came here. I started in the art school, but then I was taking so many amazing classes in arts and sciences that I decided to get 2 degrees, a BA and a B.F.A, and I couldn't stand the requirements, and I was terrible at language. I mean, I was the worst, and it's weird because now I make films in all these different languages. So I became a college scholar because that was the only way to get out of the requirements. But I really have to thank Cornell for making this possible, you know, all of these possibilities. And yeah. Anyway.
No, I think that's great. And I liked hearing about getting out of requirements, and I will keep that in mind as people ask to get out of requirements in the future. But I did see a hand up there, and I wanted to see if anyone had a question.
So, Peter, is your first question? I guess I get a mic. Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? So, Peter, I'm a graduate architect here, and I'm actually with some of my classmates from the class of 1972. So this is our 50th reunion, and many of us have had a chance to get together for the first time in 50 years, so we're enjoying that very much. But one of the things that we had a conversation with the assistant dean today was the intersection of architecture with other very important disciplines that is starting to occur. And in your educational background, and especially with your educational insights, I wonder if you have some comments to make about other disciplines that you think young architects, as in the undergraduate programs, should really be exposed to and actually have collaborative classes with in their architectural undergraduate education.
Oh, it's a really double-headed sword you're asking me, because on the one hand, I believe that you need a liberal arts background to be able to know the politics, the history, English, literature, film, painting. There's so many things that you need to know as an architect that are in the social sciences and the natural sciences that you don't have time for. You can't get advanced classes and because you don't have the kind of first year classes to take, Nabokov's really tough class. You get his survey class. So it's the way universities are set up, it's very hard to do. My feeling has always been that you have to get a broad background first and then go to graduate school and specialize. I don't think you should specialize. I think you can get a bachelor's degree of architecture. It may not be a professional degree. You could do that in 4 years and then do a 2-year master program, any number of ways. But I think that what I'm missing in my students is just the reverse today. Everybody has got philosophical background, film background, theater background, etc., and no architecture. And architecture, the pedagogical structure of the deep, necessary understanding to be able to plan and think in urban context or multiple building context, that kind of experience has slowly slipped, I think, so that my students that I get at Yale, for example, are really good at, they know philosophy, they know fine arts, they know film, way much better than their teacher. I can't keep up with them. These guys write papers for me in a seminar. I gave a seminar, probably mistakenly, from deconstruction to decolonial, and saying that there was a tie between the decolonial strategies that are being talked about today in universities came out of deconstruction, and deconstruction had an architectural side. My students just were whipped through this stuff and left because I just couldn't keep up with the reading that they did. And so I find that the students are better prepared, have access to the kinds of courses that give you a broad general education, but are missing the kinds of things that some of us as architects need to be able to not only teach them, but to practice them. And I think that's where making that balance between the two is a difficult condition today. Our students want to have more, less technical, more social justice, more kinds of decolonial, for example, that we find it difficult to fit into a curriculum in architecture. I think these things are changing. I think that, Majin, for one, brings a kind of energy to this school that I think is really important from her experience at MIT. I think that Cornell still, as an Ivy institution, and let's not forget that is important in terms of the kinds of expansiveness that can be taught at this institution. I think that these issues, what kinds of curriculum are going to be faced by many of architecture schools without hopefully losing the baby with the bathwater. I mean, I worry about architecture, but do I think an architect studying the decolonial movement is important? I do. I think it's really interesting how it relates to, the colonialism of institutions, the sort of subterfuge of open conditions that are not necessarily real. I don't know any other way to answer that question. I don't have a curriculum in mind that would be suitable for today. It's a very complex situation that we face in. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear. You're talking to.
So in that case, would you consider Colin Rowe then to be one of the great protagonists for that kind of pedagogy?
Certainly was. And I certainly, Colin is an important, well, first of all, let's be clear. Both Ungers and Rowe were both important at the time and today. Especially, I teach Matthias Ungers in a seminar. I teach the four great postmodernists were Bob Venturi for me, Aldo Rossi, Jim Sterling, and Matthias Ungers. And so I teach the Ungers time at Cornell, the Green Archipelago, the movement with Greer and Koolhaas. I play down the antagonisms between Rowe and Matthias because I don't think they were the key thing. Matthias was a great innovator in terms of urban projects. Colin was a great innovator in terms of curriculum and pedagogy. I learned my whole European history from traveling with Colin. So, but I think they were both important. And their time in Ithaca, someone has got to write the story of the Rowe Matthias Ungers dialogue, let's say, or impossible dialogue that was here because it was an important time.
Maybe I can build on that question and ask that, you know, in some ways there's teaching methodology, right? But I think what you are both sharing is kind of being in a context where you learn critical thinking and inquiry and kind of carry that forward in your continued education as a practitioner, right? As a creative practitioner. And I think, you know, teaching at this moment, and Shelly, you highlighted so many of the things that are in the minds of all of us, including educators and students, like how we can, and as both teachers, like feel the weight of the world, which I think the students and faculty all feel, and turn that critical inquiry into actualizable change, right? And you do it through your storytelling and the highlighting that, and maybe it goes back to post-structuralism, the question of truth, like what we know, what we don't know, simultaneously. And I was kind of curious if you could expound on that.
I mean, it's interesting talking about teaching artists, right? Because it's quite different. I mean, I would say that for me, teaching artists, especially at the grad level, it's really meeting them halfway. So it's really what they want to make work about, what they want to talk about. And sometimes it's not exactly what I make work about or talk about. So that's, on the other hand, when I show work to students, I do show work that I'm really passionate about, that I think do raise all these questions. The question of truth and fiction is a really interesting one right now, truth and fiction, because it's an argumented dialogue that has kind of been usurped by the right. You know, that you know, all of the groundings, they'll just shift it around. And this is something that I always found as a filmmaker. As soon as you find a kind of innovative form that works the way you want it to work, then commercial television will take it, or commercial films, advertising will take it. And now I sort of feel like the stories, you know, the amazing stories based on truth or based on the world, let's say, I hate to talk about truth, these get kidnapped very quickly. And so I think that it's a really interesting moment to think about that. It's just that we don't have a whole lot of time to think about it. That's what I think,
There's an urgency to now that.
There's an urgency to now. Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Other questions, or Peter, do you have anything you want to add? Okay, there's one question there.
So perhaps a bit naive question to ask, but we're here to celebrate the 100th year or the 150 years of the department, and there's been a lot of changes in the century. But the question I want to ask is, what do you think is eternity? Yeah. I guess it's a strange question, but.
So is the question like, what do we think, or what do Peter and Shelly think of as a constant? Is that what you mean by eternity?
What is eternal? What is
timeless?
Yeah.
Maybe is another way.
Well, when I applied to Harvard in 1949, probably 70% of the faculty were Republicans. In 2020, probably 90% are Democrats. So I think it's a big change. Same with Yale, especially Yale was 90% Republicans in 1949. So that's a big change, certainly in the university and its relationship to society.
Yeah, this idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I don't think that this is the moment for that. Yeah, I think that things are really changing at a very fast pace. And that's not to say, I come back here and teaching hasn't changed that much. I don't think. Still people in front of the room, or maybe people in a circle, but I do think that I'm not thinking that way anymore.
Maybe one thing I can, and maybe this is being positive and an optimist, and even though I was never a Cornell cheerleader, Peter, as you were, I will try to do a little bit of cheerleading. I think there's one thing that's very unique about art pedagogy and architecture pedagogy, and you refer to it a little bit, Peter, is that, we as faculty, it's more like a coaching model where we're at the student's desk. And Shelly, you're referring like you're meeting them in the studio and helping to move forward their ideas, but also bringing precedent and knowledge and methodology to the table to share. And I think that is a constant that kind of hasn't changed that much, maybe at least in the last half century. But I think what is different is maybe the speed of the changes and the questions being asked, because we're kind of, we have to teach the canon and we're decolonizing the canon simultaneously. And I think that's a project that the students and the faculty are engaged in together at this moment, which feels kind of unique and unprecedented.
I did want to say, I know that my talk was a little bit on the kind of scared side, which is absolutely true. It's the way I feel. But on the other hand, I think that we're looking at a real opportunity, a moment of change. And I see so many amazing changes coming through the university, and different dialogues and different relationships to authority, and a real questioning, a kind of very deep questioning. And so I am optimistic, but it's optimism that's geared towards change.
Cynthia?
I'll speak really loudly.
You have to use the mic.
Yeah, you get a microphone.
I agree that the world seems to be spinning much faster than it perhaps did to the futurists 100 years ago. So here's the problem. I'm in publishing, architectural publishing, and so I see how slow architecture itself is. How does architecture participate when things are moving so fast?
I think that was
You got an
for you,
answer,
Peter.
Shelly? Someone outside the discipline might have a better perspective.
I'll pass it to Peter for now. I'll think about
Oh,
it.
no, we have
Great
to ask
question.
maybe Jen. I don't-
No, I think that's a great question, right? We think of architecture as a slow medium, right? It takes many years, often 5 years, to go from like the concept to something built in the world. And tomorrow we'll have an incredible lecture from Olalekan Jefus for the Olin lecture, but he's someone that's crossing between architecture and art. And seeing your films today, I think film is probably takes a lot longer than many people think, but it's consumed in such a compressed time frame, right? You watch a film and so the kind of, I think because these mediums operate at different speeds, they can impact at different scales, maybe is my quick answer from my perspective. So we wouldn't expect architecture to have the same effect as a film, right? But then we have to understand the difference between the mediums, the power of the difference of those mediums, and then how to utilize them to actually make a better world. And we have to understand the world better in order to make a better world.
And maybe architectural theory and philosophy can push that along quicker. Easy for me to say.
Sure.
Well, like I said, easy.
Slow is okay. What's wrong with slow? You drink a glass of wine slow. Wine matures slow. They can't get over it. I mean, a good wine takes years and years and years. We pay a lot for getting a great bottle of wine. I'm more interested in students that are bottles of wine that mature slowly. I'm not interested in fast. And my last book was called Lateness. I'm against avant. I'm derriere is okay.
I think there was one
There's
question
somebody
back there.
up there with a hand.
Oh, I have a question. I guess it's following the previous question a little bit, and it's a question for both Shelly and Peter. Sorry, it's a little bit too excited to speak here. Just a little bit about my background. I just graduated from a master in AAP, and I also study a bit filmmaking at the New York Film Academy, and that's why I'm curious in this question. It's just a personal curiosity. Well, the question is, let's say both of your career, let's say film and architecture, how do you feel that those two disciplines, not in the sense of publishing or medium, but deeper into their own disciplinaries, how do you feel that they have impacted or interacted or been changed by each other? It could be a too general question, but you could specify it in any ways you like. Thank you.
I think the question is, how do you feel that film has influenced architecture and
vice versa.
architecture has influenced film?
That's an hour last answer. It's not you going to do that in 10 seconds? Take a class.
I think we have time for one more question I'm seeing. And if not, I'll call on someone to ask that question. Okay, Eric, you have the last. Oh, no, great. We have one question there. Oh, please, could you wait 1 second?
Thank you. I was a fine arts student in 1980 with Shelly. When you said that tuition was $3,300, I remember that. And I just wonder, there must be huge pressure on students who pay $60,000 to do fine arts. I wouldn't have come, I don't think, because that would have just been too much for me. I was free with I had a really good deal at Cornell, so that I have nothing to talk about. But I just wonder, what is the pressure on students these days with such high tuition?
I mean, one thing I can share is that Cornell is need blind, so we don't look at a student's finances during admissions. And then once they're admitted, we meet the full financial need of every undergraduate student. And so our goal is to be able to try to do that for the graduate students as well. But right now, at least for the undergraduate student population, anyone that wants to come here gets in. The university makes it possible through extraordinary scholarships that are made
But they
possible.
also have because we had a student who came from architecture, Hugh Hayden, and then studied with us as a grad student, and he talked about his loans. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some students have full scholarships plus stipends. Some students have a combination of scholarship and federal loans. Yeah. But I don't want to end on the loan questions. Can I ask, I'm just going to task Eric to ask the last question. Can you think of one? No pressure.
Thanks for calling on me. Thanks for the two talks. Really wonderful to see them kind of intertwined, and I really appreciate you coming back and sharing these talks with us. I kept thinking, like, who taught you at Cornell? Because when I look in the audience, I see some of my teachers here. And Peter, you refer to Colin, you refer to your swimming coach, and Shelly, you referred to all the men that were teaching here. I'm curious if any of those teachers stood out to you. I know Colin certainly did for Peter, but who was teaching here and what do we know about them? I mean,
we had great teachers. Wait a minute. Paul Rudolph was teaching here. Gary Coleman was teaching here. Aldo Jurgala was teaching here, etc. We had a man named John Hartel who was a painter, first year design, fabulous. We had a young teacher named Eric Quell, fabulous, who was taught painting. We had great teachers. Great juries. I mean, Paul Rudolph failed me in a project here. We became fast friends. I mean, to have Rudolph and Jurgala and Coleman, and of course, the hierarchy of Skidmore, Nat Owings would come. I mean, there was always a lot of energy. So Cornell was, as far as I'm concerned, in those days, the elite undergraduate education, bar none. Whether there were no really graduate schools. Princeton had a little school with John Labatut, but it was, backward looking. Cornell was an exciting place to go to school, especially if you were from New York. It was New York-based energy that flowed up here. So I don't want to dim what was, and to have Ungers and Rowe, no matter what their anxieties were, to have them here from 72 to 73 to 74 and have Creer here and have Koolhaas here and the kinds of people that came in the Berlin Summer Academy. Come on, Eric, it was second to none. Where else was there a debate like Rowe and Ungers? Didn't exist. And to have that in this place up the lake, wow. So I was, and I still am a Cornell cheerleader, okay? And I'd bleed red. And I get annoyed because they've taken the carnelian that the uniforms used to be, and now it's this sort of pukey light red that they all have. And I can't believe it. I write to every president every 5 years and say, couldn't we go back to carnelian and white? There is a song like that. No, I'm not going to sing. I promise. I promise. But yes, Shelly.
Yeah, so I would say for me, there was Norman Daly. He did this amazing project, The Civilization of Luros, a conceptual artist. And then Chaim Steinbach, who really, he's still a very dear, dear friend. And so those two. And then in arts and sciences, there was Richard Klein, there was Dominic LaCapra, there was James T. Siegel in anthropology. So there Susan Buck-Morss came, but
yeah,
just when I was leaving, so I know her, I became friends with her, but I never got to study under her. So I would say that my experience was pretty broad.
You know, it's funny because we studied with Susan Buck-Morss when we were students. So I think what this reflects is that there's a kind of spanning of generations that happens through a university like Cornell. And it's just been incredible to hear your stories and to see all of you. So please join us at the Johnson Museum on the Sculpture Terrace for some drinks and continued celebration.